Hello everyone, welcome back. In this session, we are going to learn about JavaScript. Before we get to JavaScript, let's revise a bit of what we have learned till now. So we have seen HTML, which provides us the structure of the web page. We know CSS provides us the style of the HTML tags. JavaScript, which we are going to learn now, makes the web page interactive. BootStrap is a library having inbuilt CSS and JavaScript codes. And we also saw Bootstrap grids, which contains containers, rows, and columns. So that is what we have learned till now. Next, we'll be learning about JavaScript. Using JavaScript, we'll be adding new elements, delete an element, and modify an element via some user interaction or through the server. Next, we'll be manipulating the styles of the HTML using JavaScript. After that, we'll be creating an interactive calculator. So yeah, let's get started with JavaScript. The web page we made looks good, but it is still static, which means that the user cannot interact with the website to change the way it looks. What if we want to display something when the button is clicked, or we want to change the background in dark mode on a click? All these functionalities or the logic part of the website can be added using JavaScript. We will be writing the logic of our website using JS. So first, let's briefly go over the content which we'll be learning today. First of all, we'll have an introduction to JavaScript. Next, we'll learn about functions in JavaScript. Next, we'll go for DOM manipulation. The full form of DOM is Document Object Model Manipulation. Next, we'll have a look at event handling, and then using all the things which we have learned, including Bootstrap, we'll be creating a calculator. As I said earlier, JavaScript makes the website interactive. Here in the slide, you can see the button, which looks good as we have added CSS to change its color. But how can we tell the website to do something when the button is clicked? That interactivity in a web page is added using JavaScript. We can define a function that can be called when the button is clicked. Next, we will be discussing what a function is. JavaScript functions can either be written in the script tag or can be imported as a library in the header script tag. So let's have a look at what functions are. Functions in JavaScript. Functions are reusable blocks of code that you can write once and run again and again, saving us the need to rewrite the same code again and again. This is really useful. There are a number of ways to define functions, but for now, we'll concentrate on one single type. Here we have defined a function by using the keyword function. So first of all, you can see that we are putting all our JavaScript code inside the script tag. So whenever you want to write some logic or a JavaScript code, you should do it inside the script tag. Next, when you want to create a function, you write the keyword function followed by a name of the function. Then there are parentheses after that. Inside the parentheses, you can define your own variables. So you can name the variables anything. Next, there be a curly braces inside which you have to define the operations that happen when this function is called. So this function is a very basic function which will add the two arguments and return its value. So whenever you want to run this function, you write name of the function followed by the arguments like name of function 2 comma 3, and that will return to you 5. So these are functions in JavaScript. So let's see a function in action. So I've created a very basic HTML file. You can even remove this. And as you can see, it's currently empty. Next, inside this script tag, let's create a function. So first, I'll write down the function keyword. After that, we need to specify the name of the function. So let's call it my function. After that, we need to have parentheses. So let's add some arguments to it as well. Let's say we name it my first variable. And after that, let's have a curly braces. So this is the general structure of a function. First, the function keyword, then the name of the function, then whatever arguments you want to take inside the function. Here we can write the method which will be executed when we call this function. Some of you might have noticed that the to comment in script tag, you have to use 2 forward slash, while to comment HTML code, you have to use this. So it's a bit different on if you are commenting in JavaScript or in the HTML. So anyway, coming back to our function, let's add 10 to our variable. So let's assume that our variable is an integer and we add 10 to it. But we want to visualize our results as well. So to do that, you can do console.log. Inside the log, I'll do my first variable plus 10. And that's it. Let's refresh our page, but you can't see anything being printed over here. That's because this is HTML. But when we do console.log, it goes to somewhere else. Let's find out where it goes to. So if you press F12 when you are inside your browser, you will be able to see the console. So inside the console, you can, whenever you do console.log, let's say of 10, a 10 is printed over here. So let's, so you can see we have created the function, but we haven't called it yet. I guess this might be a bit small, so I'll increase the font size. Yeah. So now that we have our function, let's call it over here and see what the result is. So I'll call my function, and when we pass over, let's say 10, we expect the output 20 to be printed on the console. So let's hit enter, and you can see a 20 was printed in the debugger console. I'll reiterate, to open this console, you'll have to press F12. By the way, the placement of the console can be on the right hand side or on the bottom. You can change it by docking it to bottom, left, and so on. So that's the basic general layout of a function. Next, let's move on to DOM manipulation. Yeah. So what is DOM exactly? So DOM has the full form, document object model. So the DOM is just a programming interface which gives you the ability to access the document and do operations over it. It basically connects your scripting language to the HTML code. I try to explain this in easy words. Everything you see in the web page inside a browser is essentially an object. Each image, each paragraph, each tag, etc. When a web page is loaded, the browser creates a document object model of the page. You can have a look at the DOM tree of the object. So there is a root element HTML inside which there is a head and a body. All the elements inside a parent element come below the parent element in this DOM tree. This tree can be traversed using JavaScript and can be manipulated, hence giving us the flexibility to change the HTML as well as the CSS of the website. Furthermore, the elements can also be given specific attributes like ID or classes, which can be used to directly access them from JavaScript. So for example, each paragraph is defined in the DOM as class para. The header paragraph, first paragraph on the page, may be unique and defined by a unique identifier ID equal to start paragraph. DOM defines the logical structure of a document. So I'll give you an example using the HTML code, and I think it will make you more acquainted with what exactly DOM is and how is it helpful. First of all, let's change the current code a bit. So what I'll do is, I haven't yet taught what events are, but I'll use them anyway. You will later come to what exactly events are and how to use them. So first of all, let's just create the basic bootstrap container, a row inside the container and a column. Inside this column, let's put a button. So I've already written some code. Our function's name is my function. So let's keep it that way. Also, as you remember, I said that in the head, this part of the code is executed before anything in the body is processed. So if we, so this would work because this function will be created before these divs are initialized. But if we want to manipulate blocks of HTML using this function, then it creates a race condition that if we try to do something before these divs are created, then this function will throw an error. Uh, if you don't understand exactly what's happening, just remember to put your script tag below the div tags in the body if you are going to manipulate the divs using the JavaScript. So we'll come to manipulating the divs now. So let's see how our website will look after this. So we have, okay, this button is not being styled by Bootstrap because we have not added the libraries. So let me just copy and paste the corresponding libraries. I've saved it. Okay, fine. The button seems to be working. Yep. So now let's see what happens when we press the button. So you can see that 20 was printed on the console. That's great. For the sake of style, let's just center align this button. Okay, great. You can ignore this error. This error is coming because we have not specified a meta tag. I'll just do it right now. So if you do this, then I guess this error will vanish. Yeah, you can ignore this. This is not necessary. So next, yeah, we have created a basic um, code. When we press the button, then this function is called. So you can see here we have an on click attribute of the button. which gets called when we click on it. And there we have written that my function with a value of 10 should be passed. So this variable gets the value 10. So we get 10 plus 10, 20 printed onto the console. So that is how we can use the buttons interactively to do some functionalities in the JavaScript. Next, let's try to change this button using JavaScript. So what we'll do is when we click the button, let's first try to access this button. So to access the button, I have added an ID to it, and the name of the ID is button. So you can think of the ID as a unique identifier for this element. To access an ID, you can do document dot get element by ID and then the name of the ID. Let's also console log this and let's see what do we get over here. So I'll refresh this page and I'll click button. You can see we got the 20 from the second console.log, and from the first console.log we got a button. When you hover over it, you can see that the HTML is getting highlighted as well. So that's great. We have accessed the button in the document using document.getElement by ID button. So document was the root, and inside that we have found an element by its ID. So let's actually go back once to our presentation. So you can see the document is at the top. So whichever element is present in the HTML would be inside the document. Hence we can do document.getElement by ID and find the button inside the document. Next, what we'll try to do is we'll try to change some properties of this button. Let's say we want to change the text of this button. So to do that, what we need to do is we have to change the inner HTML property and set it to, let's say, changed button. So the inner HTML, you can think of it as, so here the inner HTML is button. So we are accessing inner HTML and changing it to changed button. Let's save this. I'll refresh this website and I'll press button and you can see that the text has changed. So this is the first time when we are actually affecting the HTML code using JavaScript. Even though this looks like a small change, using these small changes, you can completely change your entire website. So this is how you can access your elements by using the ID. There are some other ways as well to access your elements. So let's add another ID. Let's name it, let's say, call ID. Now, if you want to access this button, let's say I remove this ID. Now, how do we access this button? Is there no way? Because we don't have any ID over here. So there is a way. Let's see how to do that. So first of all, I'll access this div by its ID. Let's just console log this document. Yeah. So let's refresh. And you can see we have the div over here. So if you remember this tree has its childs. So we can traverse the tree and access all of its childs. So let's do that. So after getting the element by ID, I'll do dot child nodes. Let's see what's getting printed on the debugger log. So when I click on the button, you can see we have a node list which has the size 3. The first is the text, next is the button, and third is again a text. So what we want is actually the button. So this node list follows a zero indexing, which means it starts from 0. So if we do node list of 1, we should be able to access our button. So if we do child nodes of 1, let's save this, refresh this, press the button. You can see we have again accessed the button element. And just like before, we can change the inner HTML to changed button. Let's take it out of the console.log. Let's refresh this and press the button. You can see that the button text has changed to changed button. So you can traverse the entire DOM structure and access your elements. There is yet another way to access elements in a document, and that's by their class names. So let's create two buttons. So keep in mind that never should two elements have the same ID. Otherwise, it can lead to weird behavior in the browser. So let's put an ID, call ID 1. Let's say we want to access all buttons which have the class btn. So to do that, there is yet another method, and that's document.get element by class name. So if we do that and we write here btn, let's console and log this. Let's also comment out all our other code. I'll refresh this. You can see now we have two buttons. Let's just add a bit of a margin. So when I press the first button or the second button, this function would get called where this would be logged on the console. So you can see we have a HTML collection which has two buttons. So we got the first button as well as the second button because both these buttons have the same class btn. Let's just change it to btn1, refresh it, and when I click over button, we only get the first button because this class value has now changed and does not match btn. So this way you can, like, let's choose the first button. So I write here 0. Let's click this button and you can see that the first button has been accessed, and we can again change its content by doing inner HTML and so on. So this is how you access and change the contents of an HTML. So there are three primary methods. First is to use the ID to access your element. Second way is to traverse the document tree and go step by step to the element you want. And the third way is to use get elements by class name to get elements which share a common class. By the way, do we really need JavaScript? So let us actually explore that possibility. One way of updating the web page is to keep refreshing your web page after, let's say, every few milliseconds. So what happens usually, let's take an example of Facebook. So you are chatting with someone. So you are sending messages, receiving messages, and whenever you receive a message, you want it to be displayed. So you can use JavaScript to do that. As you saw now, you can like change the text inside a div, a button, and you can also add new elements using JavaScript. We'll get to that later on. But one other way can be to keep on refreshing the web page. So once you refresh the web page, then a new content would come in. So that's also one way of updating the web page, but it's a really, really bad practice. So what happens is whenever you load an HTML page, there are a lot of functions happening. So what's happening is, first of all the libraries are fetched. Then the DOM structure is created. All the elements are placed and how it should look in the GUI. The styles are applied. So all these things happen when you open a web page. And if you just want to add a new chat message, then you should not do these many operations. So that will hog the network as well as your processor. So that's a really bad practice. So that is why we require JavaScript. So by the way, you have infinite possibilities of how to use your JavaScript. If you are creative enough, you can even create Facebook using plain JavaScript. But that's not the way it's done. So we'll get to frameworks in the next sessions. So I'll give you an basic idea about JavaScript, which will help you in understanding the frameworks as well. So next is event handling. Yeah, for each action that you perform in the browser, an event is triggered. A button being clicked, a page loading, a video playing, your mouse moving, hovering, your mouse being released, etc. All are events. In response to these events, we can run our own custom code. The constructs that listen out for the event happening are called event listeners, and the custom blocks of code that run in response to the event firing are called event handlers. The code block we wrote before should be called when the event of clicking a button is performed. So we already had a look when the button was being pressed, our my function is being called. So this event on click is being accessed over here. There are three ways in which we can bind to an event. So the first one we have already seen. So there is an on click attribute on the button which we are binding onto by the on click attribute. There are other ways to bind onto this event as well. So let's have a look at how exactly to bind to the event. So I'll remove the second button. Let's have only a single button. So we have already seen one way of binding to the event. Let's remove this code as well. Let's go back to our previous basic function. Yeah, so when I'm pressing on button, I'm getting a 20. So let's remove this on click. Is there any other way in which we can bind the on click event of the button to this function? So surely there is. So one way can be, let's add an ID to this button so that we are able to access it in JavaScript. To access the button, we can do document dot get element by ID and the name of the ID. And next, it has the on click property. You can see there were a lot of events on animation cancel, on animation end, and so on. There are really a lot many number of events. So you can have a look at them on Google, and we'll also have a look at some of them in the HTML debugger mode. So here on click, so we can specify a function which should be called on click. So just we can write a function over here. which is called, let's do a console.log 30 and let's save this. Let's say if 30 is printed on the console. So I'll refresh this page. Yeah, so when I press the button, you can see a 30 was printed. So this is a new way of writing a function. Instead of defining the function elsewhere, you can define the function over here and write the corresponding code, which should be called when the onClick event is triggered for this button. So this is a way of binding to the onClick event. Another way is to use the add event listener function. So the browser has already some inbuilt functions. So this add event listener function, you can type the name of the event. So we are getting some examples. So let's take the event click. Yeah. And next, let's take the name of a function. So we already have our own function. So I'll write down the name of the function over here. And that's it. You don't need to call this function. Yeah. But how do we actually know that this button's add event click listener should be updated? For that, we'll have to do this. Yeah. So we access the button first, and then we add an event listener of click to this button, which should call my function. So let's save this. I'll remove this code so that it does not interfere with our other code which we have written. Let's save this. Let's press the button. So you can see a 10 was printed. So what's happening is this my first variable gets the event variable inside it. You don't need to concern yourself with what exactly the event is. Let's just print 50 over here. Let's refresh this. So you can see a 50 was printed over here. So that's really great. Also, let's have a look at what we are getting inside the event variable. So you can see that the event is click. We have the target inside of it, which is the button. We also have the client X and the client Y, the coordinates where the button was clicked. So these type of properties are present in the event, which can be useful in your application which you build. So you can use this event variable, which is automatically added by the add event listener function. So that's it. These are the three ways in which you can access any event of a element. Now let's have a look at another example where we'll be adding new elements, removing existing elements, and also changing the CSS styling of the buttons. So what I'll do is I'll remove the code we have till now. Next, I'll copy and paste some code and I explain it to you what is happening step by step. Or better, I'll write the code while explaining it. So first, let's create a class. Let's add some margin to the container. Next, let's create a row in that, then a column. Let's center align the contents inside the call tag. By the way, even though it reads text center, it centers even the buttons, the text, and everything inside the column, even the images. Now let's add a button which has the class btn and button primary. These classes are from BootStrap. Let's add some text to this. Next, let's create another row. Let's add some margin to it as well. And I'll add two buttons over here. One having the class button and button primary, named add, and the other named remove. And it will have the danger class, meaning its color would be red. Primary stands for blue. Next, we'll also create another row where we'll add our new elements when the button add is pressed, and when remove is pressed, we'll remove contents from here. So let's add an ID to this place because we'll need to access this column. So let's name it add here, and let's leave it empty. So let's save it and see how our website will look. Yeah, so we have a here button, an add button, and a remove button. We have not applied any on-click event listeners to this, so it won't work. So let's first create the script tag and add our functions over here. So the first function would be to add an element. So let's create the function add element. Yeah. So first, what we need to do is we need to access the place where will be adding our new button. So first of all, we'll do document.get element by ID add here. But we need to store this. So to create, so we'll have to create a variable for storing this. To do that, the way is first you write var and let's name this the parent element is equal to this document dot get element by id. So whatever is returned from this function will be stored in parent element. So next, let's create var new element. So we'll be creating a new button. So document dot create element, and the name of the element is button. So this has created a new element of type button. So that's great. Next, we need to style our element a bit. To do that, the code is new element dot class list dot add button. So this would add the class button to the class list of new element. Let's add one more class named button primary. So our new button now has the color blue. Also, let's add some content inside it using inner HTML, and let's name it new button. So now we have created a new button, added some classes, updated its CSS, and changed the content inside of it. What we need to do now is add this new button to the parent element. So to do that, you can use parent element dot append child, and in this we can add new element. So whenever this new add element function is called, a new button would be added to this column. Let's attach this function to the on click event of add. Let's see if it works. Yeah, so whenever I'm clicking add, you can see new buttons are being added to the column. Let's put some margin on top of it. Yeah, so now it looks great. So next, what we want is that when we click on remove, then these buttons should be removed. So to do that, let's create a new function named remove element. When this function is called, what we want to do is we want to access the child nodes of this column and remove one from there. So first, we'll access the parent element. So I'll copy this code. And next, what we need to do is if there is a child, then we need to remove it. If there is no child, then you don't need to do anything. So we use the if condition over here. So the syntax is if parentheses the condition. If this is true, then this piece of code will be executed. Otherwise, no code will be executed. So the condition over here is that the parent element dot child nodes should not be empty. So to check if it's empty or not, we can check that the length is not equal to 0. So when the child node's length is not equal to 0, that means there is a button inside it. We want to remove a child from the parent element. So we'll remove the first child from the parent element by accessing that child through child nodes. Let's save this and bind the remove element function to the remove button. I'll reiterate what's happening in remove element. First of all, we are accessing the parent element by the get element by ID. Next, we are checking if the child node's length is not equal to 0, which means there is a button inside this div. So if there is a button, then we remove that button by accessing the first button. So the first button is removed. Let's save this. Let's refresh this. I'll add a button and I'll click on remove. And you can see that the button has been removed. So that's great. Using this, we can add new elements and also remove some new the elements which we had added. One interesting thing, if you just add an enter over here and press save, then there is a child, existing child of this column, which is text. So when you first click on remove, I have pressed remove once, nothing happened. The new button did not disappear because the first child node was the text which was present inside the div. Now if I press remove again, then this new button would be removed. So that's just an interesting thing. What you can do is you can just console.log the parent element over here to see what is exactly happening. So when I add and when I press remove, you can see that this div over here, it has child nodes. Let's find out the child nodes. Yeah, so it has child nodes with a button over here. So if I click on remove, that button is removed. So that's great. So now that we know how to add an element and remove an element, we can also update the CSS of an existing element. So what we'll do is whenever here is pressed, Let's change the color of this button from primary to danger. So first of all, let's add an ID to this, change color. Let's create a function which will change the color of that button. So we don't need an ID actually of this button. What we want is just an on-click listener which will call the change color function. We have not yet defined the change color function. Actually, we would be needing the ID as well to access this element to change its property. So color changing button. So to access the button, let's do document.get element by ID and the name of the button. Let's store it inside a variable my button. To keep a tab on what is the current color of the button, let's create a global variable named var toggle state. Let's initialize it with 0, and whenever the toggle state is 0, we know that the color is blue. Whenever it is 1, we'll know that it's red. So what we want to do is if toggle state is 0, then my button dot inner html is equal to there. So let's change the text also to there. We'll also remove the class button primary using class list dot remove, and we'll use class list to add the button danger class to it. Also, we'll update our toggle state to 1. So if the toggle state is equal to 0, then this code will be executed. Otherwise, the code inside the else block will be executed. So let's copy this code. So if the toggle state is 1, we that means that the color is red now. So it has the text there. So we'll again change it back to here. We'll remove the existing danger class and change it to primary. And we'll again set the toggle state back to 0. So that's it. Let's save this. Let's refresh this page. And you can see when I click on the here button, the text and the color of the button changes. Let's click it back again and it becomes blue again. So you can even change the CSS of the button using JavaScript. So that's it on examples of JavaScript. Now to give you an even better example of JavaScript, next we'll be building a real-time calculator on a web page. So we'll apply all the things which we have learned till now, including HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and JavaScript. So let's get started. So this is the fun part. I believe that how much ever you learn the theory, it's best to get a hands-on practice of the things you learn, because then personally I don't forget stuff if I have practiced it a bit. So I've removed everything that was in the body. Let's change the title to creating our own calculator. Let's refresh this. Yeah. So I'll just give you an example of how our calculator is going to look. So let's say I type in here 10 plus 15 and I press equal to, then I'm getting the value over here. I can also press on these buttons and it shows me the history of the calculation as well as the results in this box over here. So we are going to build this using Bootstrap and JavaScript. So let's get started. First of all, what we'll do is we'll create the basic outline of the HTML without adding any functionality or JavaScript to it. So first of all, I'll create a container and I'll add a row to it. So this is the standard procedure. I always start with creating a container, then a row. In this case, what we want is that the calculator should not take the entire width of the container. It should take 50% and it should be centered. So to do that, so there are 12 imaginary columns. To take 50% means we'll be using 6 columns. And there are 3 columns which are invisible over here. So let's add those columns. Div class call. We'll be using a large column because if the calculator width gets too small on smaller screens, that won't look good. So you can see this calculator is better than having a very narrow calculator. So that's why we'll be using call LG instead of call MD, and we'll keep the 3 imaginary columns over here and we won't add any code to it. So this will create the offset that we required. Next, I'll create another call LG with 6 columns, and here we'll add all our code. Let's add a text center class as well so that all the text inside the calculator is center aligned. To make this card look good, I've also added a shadow to it. So we'll use the BootStrap class shadow. Let's save this. So I'll refresh this. So as we have not added any content, so we don't see anything. So let's first create another row inside of this, which has the call as well. And there we write calculator. Yeah, so we have the calculator here, but let's add some margin on top of the container. So great, it looks good, but having a bit of a padding on the top would make it look even better. So to our row, let's add some uh, padding as well. Let's add it in the both the directions. Yeah, what we can do now is we can apply some styles to make the calculator look like this. So I have used the classes button and button primary to make the calculator look blue. So you can see now that the calculator is blue, but it's not taking the entire width. To make the calculator take the entire width of the column, let's create our own class named full width. So I'll create a style tag. I'll add the class full width, which will put the property of width to be 100%. Let's add it to this row. So now you can see that the calculator is taking the entire width of the row. Also, let's add some padding or margin on top of the calculator as well. Yeah, so now it looks better. Ours is a bit thicker, but that's fine. Next, let's create the text area where we'll be adding the history of our calculations. So Let's create another row. Inside that we have a column. We'll also add a margin of 3 in the y direction. And I guess you might have forgotten by now, but we also have an element in HTML named text area. So let's use that to add. Yeah, so you can see we have the text area. So let's add the full width class to this text area as well, so that it takes the entire width. Also, let's add a padding of 3 in all the directions of the text area. So this is how the text area looks. We can even type anything we want, but that's not possible over here. So we need to disable this text area. To do that, you just need to write read only attribute over here. And you can see the text area has now become ineditable. Next, let's add an ID to this because we'll be requiring it later on. And let's name it history. Also, there is an attribute named rows. So let's have our 4 rows in this text area. So you can see that the number of rows has increased. So we'll be able to see 4 rows in this text area. Also, let's add some content to this text area. So it's not visible. Just a moment. So whenever we add some content to the text area, by default, it will be center aligned because our parent class is center aligned. We want to make it right aligned as in this case. So let's add the class text right over here. So we can't actually see some text over here right now, but later on when we update the contents using JavaScript, just a moment. Yeah. So later on, when we'll be updating the contents using JavaScript, you'll be able to see the text in the right hand direction. So now that we have our text area as well, let's have a look at what other things which we require over here. So we need an input. So we are inputting some text over here. So we need to have an input element. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to create another row and break it down into 2 main columns, which will be further broken down into 3 columns. So let's start doing that. So div class row. So it will be broken down into 2 main columns. The first column would take 10 of the 12 imaginary columns. This will contain the input element of type text having the class full width so that it takes the entire width. Let's put the ID of this input as result. And that's it. An input tag does not have a slash input to close it. You don't need to close an input tag. So that's it. We have added the input. Let's have a look how this input looks like. So yeah, this input is now visible. Next. So what we need to do is we need to actually have multiple buttons below this input as well. So we'll need to create another row and a column and add the input inside of it. Yeah, it does not make any change right now, but we'll be adding multiple rows inside this column 10. So let's start adding those rows. Yeah, so it will have a column also. So just a second, this column would be of size 4. So if you just break this part down into 12 columns imaginary, each of the buttons takes 4 of the imaginary 12 columns. So this would be call 4. Next, let's create another row which has a column which has an input of type button having value equal to 1 and class full width. I hope everyone is able to understand exactly what is happening. So let's refresh it to see what happened. So using this code, we were able to add a button below the input to just add a bit of a, so there is no margin over here as well. So let's leave it out. So now we have one button. To replicate more buttons, you can just copy and paste this row below each other. And let's see. So yeah, now we have 4 buttons over here. What we want to do is we want to change its value to 1, 4, 7, and a dot. So that's it. Let's also add some padding below this. So to do that, we can just add a padding PB3 to the top column as well. So that did not work actually. I believe we need to add this padding to this column. And yeah, that works. So next, coming back to our code of creating the inputs, we were able to create one column. What I'll do is I'll just add all the other columns as well because that's a repetitive code. So I'll just copy this code and add these columns as well and the next columns. So you can see we have added all the further columns which were required inside this call 12. We have to yet complete the call 2 buttons. Also, you can see I have already assigned an on-click listener to these inputs. These, whenever this button is pressed, a function named dis is called with the value 6. So let's add these on-click event listeners to the ones which we created in the beginning as well. So when this button is pressed, we'll add, so we'll pass the value 1 to this. We'll add pass 4, we'll pass 7 and a dot. Yeah, so there is one special button in all of them, which is the equal to sign. So what should happen when we press equal to, then this expression should be evaluated. So we have a different function for this equal to sign, which is solve. So we have yet not defined the functions, but whenever this button is pressed, we'll be calling the solve function. So we have created our calculator's left hand side part. Let's create the remaining part as well. So I'll just copy the code. So let's find where the call 10 was present. and just add this code after that. By the way, all of this code will be available to you, so you can have a look at these codes to further understand how exactly the HTML part of this calculator has been written. So in this call to, you can see there's a C button which should clear the expressions which was written in the input button. So it has a different function. Next, on slash, the general function dis is called. Similarly for all the minus, plus and multiplication input buttons as well. So great, we have created the structure of the calculator, but when we click these buttons, nothing works. And you can see an error in the console saying this is not defined. So clear is not defined and so on. So let's start writing the logic part of this calculator. So for that, we'll need to add JavaScript code to script. So let's create a script tag. Inside this, first let's create the clear function. So in this function clear, what we want to do is we want to access this input element and put its inner HTML to blank. So we'll access our element by its ID, which was result, if you remember. So we have our input over here. Just a moment. Yeah. So we have the input over here, which has the ID result. So we'll get the element by its ID and set its value to blank. So if you want to change the value of an input, you need to access its value property. So let's see if this works. Let's write something. And when I press C, this input is now cleared. So great, the clear function seems to be working. Next, let's work on the dis function, which was called whenever we press these buttons. So you can see this is not defined. So let's first define this function. Next, so you can see a value is passed whenever the dis function is called. So we'll get that value using the argument. Next, what we want to do is inside result, we want to append whatever button we press. So to append, we can directly do plus equal to the value. This is just a short notation of writing value is equal to the current value plus the value which we got from the arguments. So the shorthand notation of writing this is just plus equal to. Let's see if these buttons work right now. So when I press 258, you can see these values are being passed over here and being appended to the value of result. So great, our calculator now seems to be working, but there is one catch. The equal to sign yet does not work because we have not written the solve function. So let's write the solve function as well. So great, we have defined the solve function. So let's first analyze what our solve function should do. It should evaluate this expression, whichever is present in this input, and then create a history of it in the text area. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to access the history. So let's create a var text area element and get it by document.getElementById history. So if we go back to our text area, yeah, you can see I have already provided it with an ID of history. So we have the text area element. Next, we need to get the expression in this input. So we can do that by document.getElement by ID result.value. So var, let's name it just x is equal to this value. Inside JavaScript, there is a really nice pre-built function written named eval. So we'll just use eval to evaluate the string which was present inside this input. You don't need to worry. Even I did not know about this function before taking the session. What I did was I searched on JavaScript on Google that is there a function which can evaluate a string expression, and it gave me the results. So whenever you feel that you want to do something, just first search it on Google if it is already present, and it will save you a lot of time. So now we have our results inside the y variable. What we need to do is we need to first clear the text present in the input. So to do that, we can just reuse our clear function. So we can clear the function by this command. Next, what we need to do is we need to write the results and the expression in the history. So text area element dot value is equal to text area element dot value plus x, which was the expression, plus equal to plus y, which was the result, and an enter. So those familiar with coding would know that slash n is for new line. Those who are not familiar, this is nothing but a cool way of writing enter. So that should add our text inside the history as well. Let's save this and see whether this works or not. So let's clear this. I'll write 2 plus 3 equal to, so yeah, you can see that we are getting our expression over here. So that's really great. We have built our own calculator. So yeah, it's working perfectly fine. So the basic idea was we spent a lot of time in building the exact structure of the HTML. We added some on-click event listeners, and then we binded them to the functions. In the functions, we wrote the logic that when clear is called, the result value should be made blank. Whenever this is called, the value should be appended to the input. Next, whenever solve is called, the text area should be cleared, its values should be evaluated, and they should be displayed in the text area element. So we can also reduce this code by doing a plus equal to, just like we did in the function dis. So if we do 3 plus 9 equal to, um, okay, it gave an error. So let's just revert back to the previous method. Let's clear it. So clear has stopped working. There seems to be some error. Yeah, so that's now solved. Yeah, so there was some caching error because of which I was not able to get it work properly. I just did Control Shift R or hard reload, and it's working perfectly fine now. So that's it. Um, I guess this is it about building a calculator. Also, if you notice, the calculator looks really nice even when you keep on decreasing the width of the window. It does not collapse. That's because of Bootstrap. It's being automatically responsive. And using JavaScript, you have already seen how we have added the logic. You can maybe style this a little better by adding some padding on top of these buttons, but you can do that. So that's left for you. Also, you can see that the text area can be automatically changed. And when the text goes beyond the size of the text area, a scroll bar is introduced. So that's great. Yeah, so we have created a calculator. Let's just revise what we have learned in this session. We understood that JavaScript is the logic of a website and it can be used to manipulate the way we see the website. Next, we learned about functions in JavaScript. Next, we learned how to manipulate some elements or tags using JavaScript. And then we created a calculator where we applied all the knowledge we have learned till now. We'll be learning tomorrow Angular, a powerful JavaScript framework. And another way, so we'll learn about Ionic, which will help us to create a web page directly to a mobile application. So you might be thinking, we have already learned JavaScript and we can start building web pages. So why do we need an Angular, which is just a JavaScript framework? So if you start creating very big websites, let's say Facebook, and you start manipulating every element by writing down a JavaScript code, your website code can go beyond 10,000 lines very quickly. And to manage such a big website, it's really difficult to manage such a big website. So Angular is a framework which allows you to write less code and do really awesome stuff using JavaScript. So we'll be learning about Angular. And one of the major advantages of Angular is that when you write your code in Angular, you can easily use Ionic, which will convert your Angular web page to a mobile application. Usually, what happens is that whenever you want to create your own app, let's say for Android, iOS, and Windows Phone, then you need to write the code for Android in Java or Kotlin. Then you need to write your code again in C++, and then for a Windows phone, let's say let's say you really want to create for a Windows phone because nobody uses it right now. But if you want to create it, then you'll need to write the code in a C hash language as well. So you'll need to learn three languages. And then if you want to even have it on a web browser, you'll need to learn JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So managing all those four applications is really tough. What Ionic does is you just write down a web page code and it converts your web page to all the applications, iOS as well as Windows as well as Android. Isn't that great? So, so to learn about Angular and Ionic, you need to install Node.js and Visual Studio Code. So these links will be providing to you via email as well. Also, you need to run the basic Hello World code of generating a Hello World application on Angular. So you'll need to run these commands. We'll provide them to you via email as well. If you have some installation errors, then please note them down. We'll be taking them in the next session. So yeah, that's it. So please remember to run these commands as well. We'll be having the next session now. So please join by the link provided to you of Google Meet or Zoom. Thank you.